Record too. Let's see. Can share to my page too. Mm-hmm. All right, well, we might as well get started.
Okay.
And, people will join us. So I'm so glad to be with you, Maggie. I love you.
Same way, Heather. I love you.
Yeah.
On this journey together.
Yeah, me too. So I wanted to bring you on, and because you've been really an influential person in my life, and I think a really important person to understand like the history of organizing for white people. Because when I really got involved in anti-racism and organizing, I didn't think other white people really cared, were really doing this work, and I was feeling really isolated and alone. And so, you know, little did I know, like when I walked into the Undoing Racism training, that I was there, you know, because of the organizing that you had done for years or decades. And I think I hadn't met you first, like right away. And then, you know, I had just told you this before, that like the first time that we met, I was like, because you had been doing this for a while and you knew all the things and you knew all the people. And I was like, who is this lady? Like, who does she think that she is? And I look back on that and laugh because it's so much of the internalized superiority and coming out, you know, and like that I was just programmed to be competitive with someone who looked like me, especially, but just competition in general. And it's laughable now because I've learned so much from you and feel so connected with you at a heart level, and feel like I've learned so much about myself, like through you. And so I'm just really grateful to be having this conversation. And also that I can share that with you and we can laugh about it.
Yeah.
You know?
I had no clue.
Yeah. Yeah.
Like, oh.
So can you tell people a little bit about who you are and your journey, like how you came to anti-racism?
Okay. I grew up in a white suburb, and I always had this feeling that because I lived in a nice house in a suburb where there were only white people, but I knew that in Orange and in East Orange, there were poor people and people who lived in projects and people who came to Livingston to work in the restaurants and to clean people's houses. And I just always had a feeling, as since the time I was a child, that there was something wrong. And I kind of, when I graduated from high school, I kind of vowed that I would not continue to be in a middle-class white environment, because I knew that there was so much more, and I knew that for some reason I was being, I don't want to say held back, but I was being limited as a human being by what I lived and saw around me. And of course, being privy to, you know, comments and attitudes and that I didn't understand. So, of course, we didn't know anything about anti-racism. We didn't call it anti-racism, but I ended up going to Essex County College for a year. in Newark. And then I went to Livingston College, which was an intentional multicultural institution set up after the Newark riots. And I learned a tremendous amount there, wonderful professors. It was really, I don't want to say breeding ground, but we all had opportunities to explore. And very, very, it was very interesting, the mix of people. And as I got older, I just felt like, well, and I married out of my race, my religion, and my culture. And was trying to figure out, you know, I was carrying this tremendous angst around with me, and not having clarity, and being depressed by what I saw around me. And I came to the Unitarian congregation in Montclair by accident. Was looking for a place for my daughter to have her sweet 16. And I got involved with some members of the congregation there. And at that time, and there's a commitment to racial justice and social justice among the Unitarian denomination. And there I met a group formed. It was first called Race Watch. And I guess this was in the 90s, in the early 90s. And there was more and more awareness was rising. And we had this bulletin board where people cut out articles about racism and put them up on the board. But that was good because it was information sharing. But there was a group of us who wanted to go past the diversity model that so many of us carry around with us, and really go to the nuts and bolts of racism. And we did some research, and we found People's Institute for Survival and Beyond out of New Orleans. And we did our first 2.5-day training with them in 1994.
Wow.
Yeah. And it was almost like, it was so transformational. Everything finally made sense to me. Mm-hmm. That the way that it was an analysis of racism in all its forms, done lovingly and kindly by the trainers. And since then, they became my mentors, and they still are my mentors all these years later, 30 years later. We didn't have role models for white anti-racists. We didn't have role models. I mean, I knew about the Grimke sisters and a woman named Anne Braden, who was a white anti-racist writer, an author named Lillian Smith, who wrote Strange Fruit, Jane Elliott, who did the Brown Eyes, Blue Eyes, the collar experiment. She's still training.
Yes.
And it was not until we learned in People's Institute that there was an analysis of whiteness.
Yes.
And the way that whiteness was approached was, it was explained very clearly that there was a hierarchy and whites were at the top, but also gave a wonderful explanation of how the various cultures of people who call themselves white or think that they're white came from mostly from Europe and maybe from other parts of the world, how we gave up certain parts of ourselves in order to be part of that white collective and to have that privilege, whether you want to call it skin privilege, white privilege, that comes with dominant culture. All right, doesn't mean everyone, you can be poor, a poor white person, and still have some modicum of privilege based on what you look like. So that's how I came to it. And it was, we held a lot of educational forums. We did book study. We we really nurtured ourselves as anti-racists. It was mostly a white group, but there were a few people of color, and we were steadfast in our faith, and we continued to host workshops year after year, and we continued to have fundraisers year after year. Maybe someone remembers Dance for Justice.
Mm.
We used to have our fundraisers at the Women's Club in Upper Montclair. So I was a teacher at the time in Newark Public Schools. And after developing the anti-racist perspective, then you see, well, how can I teach Thanksgiving like this? And how can I teach Columbus Day like this?
Yeah.
And how can I teach my immigrant children coming from Ecuador and the Dominican Republic that everything's going to be hunky-dory and they're not going to experience any racism?
Right. You start to see it everywhere. Yeah.
Yeah, of course. And of course, as you mentioned earlier, Heather, you know, when you're kind of in an anti-racist, you have those perspectives and those outlooks. Often you are very much alone.
Yes.
Among other white people.
Yeah.
So I took some flack, but it was all good. It was all good. And somehow I just kept going on, just because in your heart of hearts, you just know that something is right and you don't really have to think about it too much. You just act on it.
Yeah.
So that's how I came to doing anti-racism work. Yeah, it just becomes like part of your identity, and we're constantly working. I know I'm constantly working on an anti-racist identity. It doesn't mean like you jump from point A to point B. I'm constantly working on my anti-racist identity because it's really easy being a person who has some inherited wealth, and I'm educated and I have skin privilege, obviously. It's really easy to kind of forget and to kind of sit back and not do anything if I don't feel like doing anything.
Right.
And I know that you can relate to that, Heather, because most of us do relate to that, like that we're in it for the long haul and it's going to have its ups and downs. But I find the hardest part has always been talking to other white people.
Yeah.
That's been the hardest part. And that's the part that's the integral part. That's our part.
Yes. It's the part that brings up, I think, for me, the most pain points. Because I have to really look at myself, as well as like explore how I've been treated and how I've learned things and how I've learned the wrong things, and being able to talk about that in a way that I'm not triggered, which I haven't been great at all the time. You know, I mean, for me, that's like a growing process, definitely. But yeah, like, so how that's been the biggest growing edge for me. And I think that, you know, that's why this is the growing edge, is because that has been the call, you know, from the People's Institute, from before the People's Institute, from, you know, Black organizers in the civil rights movement. And so how have you found working with other white people? Like, what advice do you have? What's worked? What hasn't worked?
Well, one of the other characteristics is that, I mean, we could go through the whole list of characteristics of whiteness, because plenty of anthropologists and sociologists have listed characteristics of other cultures. Now it's time that we take a good look at white people and our characteristics, like competition, like individualism, like perfectionism, like having to be the center of attention, like being the authority. I mean, this is all coming out. I still have some angst and I still have some anger that I'm working through. Maybe we want to call it righteous anger.
Yeah.
But I realize that having that anger is not going to help me to maintain a compassionate understanding of where people are, why people are where they are, what they know, what they don't know. A lot of it is about what they don't know, or what they think they know. So it's really required a lot of patience, a lot of introspection, a lot of internal work. I meditate. I study Buddhism. I pray. I try to be present all the time, and I try to have that knowledge that you sometimes you just need some cold hard facts to be able to tell somebody something, that they might not know. One of the things about People's Institute is there's an offshoot of, as you know, a group called European Dissent, DISSENT. And it's a collective, it's a nationwide collective of white people who are working on our whiteness and how to process the power and privilege the unearned power and privilege that we have in the society, turning it into tools to dismantle racism on the systemic level. That's all very well and good. The other half is our personal, our stuff, our internal work. And I think both are necessary to do. We need to do both.
Tell me if this resonates with you, because my internal work has been, I think, twofold. It's been reconnecting with the ancestors that I have, or even the ones that I have that I don't know, but just starting to kind of get a feel for what they were possibly going through, maybe why they made the decisions that they made, what they gave up in order to be white, and maybe even what were the pain points around that. And I know we've talked about, we're both Irish, right?
Dutch, English.
Yeah. So yeah, we've talked about that common heritage, and I don't know. So that's one part, that I wonder how that's impacted you. And then the other part, I think, for me is how all of those values around competition and individualism and perfectionism, how it impacted my self-worth, my connection to who I am at the core. And that for me has been some of the personal work, right? Of undoing that, that I'm an okay person, right? And then it's made me been able to withstand connecting with other people and accepting their flaws, right? Because it's not our wounds bumping up against each other as much anymore.
Yeah, let me say first that I was raised in a kind of very eccentric household. My mother is a war bride from England, and she married my father during World War II. So you can imagine the bombs are falling and their house is on fire, and people are suffering everywhere, but they managed to fall in love, and my mother and my sister eventually made it here. My mother didn't come as an American who had been conditioned with racism as a citizen. Not to say there's not racism in England, but it wasn't part of her experience. So she was always kind of benign, but kind. And my father was raised in a more affluent family where they had servants Black servants, and maybe one or two. I mean, they didn't have a house full of servants, but I remember my father telling me that the Black people who worked for them were the only people that were nice to him. He had a very, well, there was a lot of intergenerational trauma on his side of the family. Mm-hmm. And of course it was never resolved. And, you know, that pain just was passed on to me too, and my sisters.
Yes.
But he was always very, I don't want to say sympathetic, but he kind of got the emotional connection of people who he felt really cared for him, and yeah. And always made it clear, you know, to us that it's the best thing was just to be kind, and to be grateful to people who are kind to you. What was the other part of your question?
Just, the other part was just how like the internalized racism really, or, you know, being the perpetrators of racism, right, willingly or unwillingly,
yeah,
has done damage like on the inside, right, and of like, for me, like my ability to love myself, like the self-worth, and part of like the undoing has been pulling out all of that stuff that isn't truly who I am, but was programmed in there.
Yeah. So there was a lot of shame and depression, and not a lot of self-esteem, because, and just, I would say some neglect.
Yeah.
And when I started to associate with other kinds of people, and this is part of the whole reason why many of us are attracted to people of color and to Latinos and to other cultures, is because our own culture, and I'm speaking in generalization, and I'll probably get a nasty email from somebody about this, but we are often very, very bereft of those kinds of celebratory interconnectedness, all the things, because our attention has gone to competition, individualism, keeping up with the Joneses. I mean, because of the capitalistic culture, you know, it trains you to do that and to be right. A consumer.
We're very like from the head up, and like, you know,
so
anxious and focused, and yeah.
So you can call it like, you know, being a culture vulture, mm-hmm. you know, and going to other types of people because we have that need to connect in that way.
Right.
Whether it's music, the arts, whether it's through food, like some of the more tangible aspects of culture. But it kind of fits in with the idea that we had to give those things up.
Right.
We gave up our language, although we didn't have to give up English because we spoke English already. But other cultures, you know, after one generation, you don't speak Italian anymore. You don't speak Polish anymore. You don't speak Russian anymore, Spanish, because if you want to make it, that's not a priority. So, you know, we see that it's still going on. It's still happening. But yeah, and just, my father used to have a lot of interesting phrases about people, you know, like people who were just really hard and really tight and really unyielding people. And he didn't like those kind of people. You know, so he drank, you know, that's how he dealt with his sadness and his depression.
Yeah. Well, I think he's not alone in that. And I've often wondered, like, you know, the epidemic of alcoholism amongst white men, you know, how much is it connected to this pain of not being able to keep up with what they're told that
Yes.
they are supposed to achieve, you know?
Right. And that,
And
that the pressure of the patriarchy, because the patriarchy is so inter, inter, intermingled
yes.
with that, the pressure of that. Yes. I'm sorry, I interrupted you.
No, no, I mean, it's all right, but I think that's all I was going to say.
Yeah. Yeah.
But yeah, I mean, I think it's, you know, it's like peeling back those layers of pain, you know, that were, I don't know, I just thought that it was always like that way. It was just, that's just the way it is, you know? Um, and realizing, like, after the workshop, after many workshops, um, oh my gosh, like, you just see more and more the impact that the programming of racism has
Mm-hmm.
on, like, the very, like, our DNA. Because if we're talking about trauma, right, and the ancestral trauma, that it's in us, you know.
Right. Yeah. I worked in a school in Newark, a largely Latino school, Latinx school. And the principal was Puerto Rican. And the kids were Puerto Rican, Dominican. Most of the teachers were white or Italian, a few black teachers mixed in. But it was a beautiful place to be. The principal greeted every person who walked in the door in the morning. He greeted every teacher coming into the building.
Mm-hmm.
And then he went around to every classroom and greeted all the children. I never experienced anything like that in my life.
Yeah, right.
I thought, wow, this is so nice. This is such a nice way to connect with people. I often, part of my angst is, you know, when we've discussed this before, Heather, is kind of how we as white people treat each other. Um, you know, maybe the lack of feeling welcome somewhere, lack of eye contact. When people meet you, they want to know, well, what do you do versus, hi, how are you?
Yeah.
You know, how are you doing? What's your name? You know, it's what do you do? I mean, there's a whole culture built around like these mean girls type of culture, and the humor in people mistreating each other. Not to say that people don't mistreat each other in other cultures, but I think there's a distancing. It's always a
Yeah.
distancing
Mm-hmm.
that occurs based on some unwritten rule of status.
Right.
Um,
I
and
think it
that,
has a big impact, like, even just in so many ways of, like, you know, People's Institute talks about, like, the dehumanizing impact of racism. And for me, I think it's like that nobody's able to really show up as their full self,
mm-hmm,
because the minute that you do something that's outside of what is, like, accepted as the status quo, that there's a way. And I still, after all these years, I don't quite have the words to describe what it is, but you know that you're on the outs. Like, my spidey sense can pick that up in a second.
mm-hmm,
Like, oh, I did something that that person doesn't like, and I'm gonna get it. And it's not like necessarily, because we don't really like conflict too much, right? Like, it's not like you're gonna get yelled at, but there's something that's coming your way. And I feel like that is such, like, this collective, like,
yes,
right now, that is, like, escalating around, like, this is the right way to handle it, and you step out of line, and, like, you're gonna get dealt with.
it's like, who does she think she is?
Yeah.
Type of thing. When I was teaching, I stopped going to, I taught in 2 different schools in Newark. I just stopped going to the teacher's room because there was so much negativity. And it was mostly white teachers. So much negativity and so much criticism of children and their families. And sometimes when I would walk into the teacher's room, it would go silent. And then I found out that I was referred to as Miss Affirmative Action.
Oh.
I don't quite know what that was supposed to mean. I guess it was supposed to be some kind of put down, but yeah, I mean, not to say that I didn't have good experiences, because I did, but it's that I think once you start questioning the way things are done, you're not part of that smooth running of the machine.
Yeah.
And you're identified pretty quickly.
Yeah.
And yeah, I mean, there were white people lynched in the South for that, and Jane Elliott actually lost her career, and her family had to move from the Midwest. I think they lived in Kansas, because this little experiment that she did with children, based on whether they had blue eyes or brown eyes, it destroyed her career.
Wow.
Because she was challenging the status quo,
Right.
and challenging all these conditioned beliefs that people have about, who's better, who's entitled to this, and who's entitled to that, and who's not entitled. Yeah.
So it's been helpful for me to understand, like, why there is this kind of divide and conquer, or how maybe race is used as divide and conquer, like the creation of it. Because I think some, like you said, we might get some like hate mail or whatever, but I think then people start to feel like, oh, you're picking on white people, like what's wrong with us? But like learning from history and like how it was set up this way for us to be this protective layer for the elite, right? That's why whiteness was created, so that we would hold things in place, keep Black folks at the bottom, and protect the elite. And so that, to me, like that context is really helpful in knowing like this is a setup. We've been set up to fight each other, and and when anyone is like kind of breaking that code, they're going to get tossed aside, because you're going to mess this deal up for all of us. Like we're going to lose this access to better things.
Well, it is divide and conquer, I mean, that's very clear. You go back to Bacon's Rebellion, that's when it became codified, when the Scotch-Irish overseers were put in charge of controlling the masses. Enslaved Africans, free Africans, Native people, indentured servants, they actually outnumbered the elite classes, the ruling class, the British ruling class. And when there was a rebellion, and I can't remember the details of it, but as you said, Heather, that the layer that was put there were the Scotch-Irish, and they could be considered the overseers on the plantation, later on in time, because they controlled the masses, and they would get some crumbs for that. They would get a little bit more status for that.
Right.
If they bought into that, because I mean, if that were you, what would you do? You want your kids to have a little bit more food every day. So that's part of our mentality.
Right.
Maybe not. Yeah.
We've lost like connection to the fact that we're being set up also, like this, you know what I mean? Like that history, and the fact that we didn't get here by accident, right. With all of these resources and power, that it was set up that way.
It was intentional. I mean, and even our labor unions were largely segregated for quite some time. And of course, that whole, the mentality, of that, of disenfranchised poor white people, impoverished white people, who were as poor as the poor, but they could say, well, at least I'm not Black.
Yeah.
And that was, and they're kind of still doing it, even though it's you know, it kind of comes out in other ways. It comes out in them voting against their own self-interest, let's say, whether it's Medicare expansion or gun control, which probably guns kill more white people. So that mentality and is what keeps the system in place.
Yeah.
And has created greater income inequality. Yeah, we've been sold a bill of goods, as Ron Chisholm would say.
Yes.
Sold
Yeah.
a bill of goods. It was done to us.
Yeah. Yeah. It really was.
Mm-hmm.
So switching gears a little bit, I know I got a bunch of emails over the last few weeks or month or so from people, especially who are interested in like organizing with their children's schools.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that that's a place where a lot of us can get active around because
Mm-hmm.
I think that there's like a core desire that we want something better for our kids. And there is
Mm-hmm.
some kind of collective awakening for white people around, wait a minute, like something's wrong here. Like it feels different. It feels there's just more people awakening.
Yeah.
So I know you've had a part in organizing some stuff in schools, and I was wondering if you wanted to share what worked, or some thoughts on that.
Well, I did work in the schools that I taught in, as best I could, you know, trying to follow the curriculum. I actually had a lot of academic freedom in Newark. But I've been living in Montclair for many years, and as part of our committee at the Unitarian Church, we approached just about all of the superintendents since 1995, 96. We were like really like psyched and wired, like, wow, you got to do this. This is amazing. This will change your life, you know, like, but it didn't happen for a long, long time. It took about 20 years of advocacy. First of all, it's really hard to get into the school system if you're not an employee. You know, there's all kinds of, and then even if you want to get in and do like staff development, you have to jump through a lot of hoops. But since I had been in Montclair and, you know, doing workshops in various places and workshops on whiteness, we did some together at NJEA. Remember those?
I do. Yeah.
And I thought the best way to put pressure on the Board of Education was to develop community support. And some people in Montclair had already been trained by People's Institute, but not nearly enough at that time. We're still hearing white people saying, well, no, I don't really need that workshop. You know, I'm not a racist. Not quite understanding that it's about organizing and it's about advocacy. It's not about whether you're a racist or not. It's about being a better organizer.
Yeah.
So I got a grant and had a community workshop in 2014, which was open to Essex County. But we got a lot of Montclair people and some police officers, some Board of Ed members, some Achievement Gap people, panel people, some community people. And it was a good workshop. And as a result of that workshop, people, going back to the interim superintendent at the time that we had, and meetings that I had with our funders and the superintendent, to figure out how we could proceed to train every staff person in the district. And we started in 2015, and finished in, I think, 2017. We had, maybe 15 workshops. Bonnie Cushing was one of the trainers, very good trainer. There's always politics going on, but I have to say that the superintendent for equity did seek out funding, and so that the workshops could continue. And then after the workshops were over, it was kind of hard because staff people had changed. It was kind of hard to get into the school district to do follow-up.
Yeah.
Which is really, you have to debrief people. You got to just see where people are. You can't just give them all this information over 2 days and just expect people to know what to do with it.
Yeah.
And people need support. They need emotional support. They need, they just need to be around people to be able to process all that.
Right.
And there was one group that formed internally, which they're still functioning. It's called TURN, Teachers Undoing Racism Now. It came from teachers. Rodney Jackson began it. And they did some really, really good work and are continuing to do good work. But as far as something that is an ongoing effort from the Board of Ed, I don't believe there's anything. I know there's always a superintendent of equity. We just got new superintendent. We got 2 new people, several new people in. And one of the things that we did want to do was have workshops for parents.
Yeah.
There's a lot of disparity in Montclair, as there is everywhere. There's some very entitled parents that want more for their children. And then there's, the same old story, the kids, the Black and brown kids that get stuck in the lower track and can't seem to get out of it. There's discipline issues, all the issues that go on in schools and that are very apparent in integrated school systems, because you can really see it. But for anyone who would want to do that, I would recommend just starting with a small group and doing your grassroots organizing and getting community support, and then going to board meetings and advocating, or having meetings with the people who do staff development. Teachers are required to have how many hours of staff development a year? I can't remember the hours, but it's a requirement. So there's no quick fix. It's not easy. It's like there's going to be ups and downs, and you have your good days and your bad days. And also getting the support of different institutions in the community. Like maybe you have a YMCA who is on board, or you have NAACP on board, or you have a Blue Wave in town, or you have other organizations that you could bring in to take a training.
Yeah.
I mean, with the pandemic now, everything's all different, but it's something to think about.
I've found, it sounds like this is true for you. I've found in the organizing that I've done that it doesn't really work out in the way that I was taught in school. Like it's not really linear, right? That it's really like synergistic and based on relationship. And so that the more that you're kind of doing the work and having the conversations and bringing this up in different places, then you will just synergistically, or by divine intervention, or whatever you want to call it, that you will be connected to other people who are similar minded. And there will be something will grow out of that. And it's like every time that something big has happened, like training a full school district is like it's nothing that you could have fully planned and predicted. It's like you have to build those relationships and see where like the journey takes you. And it's taught me a lot about like trusting the journey and trusting like how, you know, things will unfold as they need to, you know, and like, and balancing both things, right? This is urgent and also there's no quick fix. And it's like, wait, how do these two things like coexist at the same time? But they have to.
And parents have a lot of say. Parents, certain parents are listened to more than other parents, but I think that's really important that people have the same analysis, so that everybody's on the same page. Because if you want the same thing, you have to come with the same approach. Otherwise, you're going to have your loose cannons, and you know, it's really important that you have clarity.
Right. So that's, I was going to ask you to talk more about that, because I think that's, you know, there's so much information out there now, more than there was in 1994 when you started. And just the internet is like booming with like anti-racist information, and then, you know, with those of us who are white who get in power, then all of a sudden we're like, I know how to fix it.
Let's do something.
Right. And, you know, and it comes from such a good place, you know, but at the same time, like, not knowing, you don't know what you don't know, you know, and then like having to wrestle with all this. So, I agree in terms of that point around the analysis, right? And it's from the Undoing Racism workshop from People's Institute is so, I found it so helpful and so effective at getting a collective of people to understand, oh, okay, this is what we're talking about. And, you know, not that like, you know, People's Institute will say like, we're not the movement, we're part of the movement. There's certainly other people who, you know, have an analysis, but I think that that's a key thing for people to understand. I was like in a meeting earlier today where it was just, we're going around in circles, because I think, you know, people are coming from different places and different understandings. And I've, you know, come to realize that that's on purpose, you know, like that is part of the setup, right? That we have been, you know, because of redlining, we don't live next to each other. We don't have a lot of cross-racial relationships. So we have, you know, these literally two different Americas, and two different understandings of the way that the world works. And I'm thinking that it's the same for you, that you found the workshop, or, you know, the analysis around racism is like something that brings us together, and that common language, the shared analysis.
Yeah, I think the way that the People's Institute presents the idea of why people are poor really kind of uncovers like the basis of, you know, you could work two jobs and still be impoverished trying to support a family, when somebody else could be living off their dividends, their inherited wealth dividends, but that person who's working two jobs is still called lazy or unmotivated, or thought of as less than intelligent. I think that whole analysis of like the myth of the meritocracy, if you work hard enough, I mean, I'm not saying there's not examples of that, but for the vast majority of people, the way the system is set up, it's set up in a certain way. You look at terms like gatekeeping, some of the principles of People's Institute training. You look at gatekeeping. Someone's letting people in and someone's letting people out. Accountability. Who are you accountable to? Are you accountable to your clients and to your students, or are you accountable to you're accountable to your shareholders? Help me out. There's more. There's a whole bunch of more principles, but just to be on that same understanding that, and then looking at what's considered the pathologies of people as a way to justify people being in oppressive situations, because they suffer from these pathologies, and it's intergenerational. Well, ours are also, but
Right.
we're not living in an impoverished situation where there might be no chance of us getting out
Yeah.
and having a different life. Is that what you wanted me to answer that question?
No, I mean, I don't know if I had a direct question, but I think I was just speaking to like the effectiveness of having like a shared analysis in terms of the organizing.
Yeah.
And and I think the other thing too, you know, you were kind of saying like the follow up or like the afterwards, right? Is like this to me, like attending the workshop is just the beginning, right? You just, the wool is pulled off your eyes and you're like, oh, okay, this is what's going on. And then it's really, you know, how do we start, you start to see everywhere, you know, how this is ingrained in the fabric of
Mm-hmm.
everything. And then how do we start to undo that, and you know, in our environment and also like inside of us. And so that's for me where it's been really important to have a collective of people.
Mm-hmm.
I know for me where like our relationship has been so important. When I can like come crying to you, like, I don't know, my life is falling apart, like, you know, and we can understand like how race is a part of it.
Right.
Um,
Right.
and
Yeah. And this is well, I feel like now, not being in this pandemic, I really want to be with people,
mhm,
and I can't.
mhm,
I mean, we can be like this, which is great, but there's nothing like being in the energy in a room full of white people talking about whiteness.
yeah,
Yeah.
because it's
And
the truth. It's like what the truth
it's
feels
the
like.
truth. It's what the
Yeah.
truth feels like. I mean, there's books written about how fragile we are, how like we can't even say the word white. You know, we can't even say I'm white. You know, because there's so much, and we can call it trauma, but it's a different kind of trauma.
Mhm.
It's a more internalized kind of superiority trauma, maybe even not superiority in all instances, but and of course now now that there's been this awakening based on, you know, seeing so many Black people being killed for no reason, um, by white people, by the media. I mean, not to say that this has not been going on since the inception of the country. Um, and I mean, I do feel some anger still. I'm still not over my angry white woman phase, um, of, you know, white people who would not be open to talking about racism or whiteness, because they well, no, I'm not a racist, like trying to mistake, um, making that mistake that if you're just a nice person and you treat other people well, then, you know, you don't need to have to study racism, you know. And now, you know, I've been getting a lot of emails and a lot of communication of like, oh, you know, let's do, you know, we have to, it's like this awakening. And it's like, I'm thinking, well, where were you before? You know, when you had a chance to come to a free workshop, where were you, you know?
Yeah.
So I mean, I have to be honest that, you know, I'm really happy that so many people are becoming aware, but I don't want it to be like a Woodstock moment where like when things die down and we just go back to the same thing,
Yeah.
um, because that's been known to happen
Yeah.
among us. Um, I just feel that like one of the things that came out of, I mean, one of the misconceptions is that 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 by giving up, this is what a lot of people say, giving up our privilege. Well, what does that mean? Giving up our privilege. Why would we want to give up our privilege? Well, that's kind of, I mean, to dismantle racism, that's kind of working on the scarcity model that that there isn't enough to go around.
Yes.
But I have gained so much just from having this analysis, from having been privileged to go to so many workshops and host so many workshops and be part of so many workshops, that I've gained so much as a human being. And it's more than I could ever hope for in my life, right, to be able to get back some of that.
Yeah.
That we were conditioned, that it's not important. Don't look at those poor people over there.
Right.
Oh, that's a bad neighborhood. Don't go over there. Well, that's AKA Black neighborhood. I mean, when we can get past that, we can get past, they're like walls that are in our minds. It's conditioning. You're a psychologist, you know that.
Yeah.
It's conditioning. When it's like going through a therapeutic process and finally understanding a little bit more about yourself, or meditating and finally like, oh wow, that's just a thought, that's not real, that's just a thought. So what we gain is so much greater than like feeling threatened and feeling fragile and like, oh, this is too uncomfortable, I can't talk about this, and crying and all this kind of thing.
Yeah. And having to live like trying to control everything when that is like there's nothing that you can control. But I agree, I found so much from this work. I mean, it's definitely not easy, but I found, always desiring like a deeper connection with people. Mm-hmm. And understanding and knowing myself. And this has definitely been the route for uncovering that. And I think, it is a lifetime kind of commitment, but I think that we're both committed to it, and I'm also committed to growing that collective, you know what I mean, with other people, as hard as it is, as much as I'm feeling similar to you, like, wait, it's all y'all who have like cast me out, for the last 2 decades, and finding it in my heart to have compassion for why that might have been, and other times that I've cast people out, because I've been afraid, and it's not easy, because that still comes up for me as well, and and I don't know. So I'm just I'm grateful to be here with you, for you to share all your knowledge, and I also wanted to just shout out the People's Institute and Dr. Kim and Ron Chisholm and all of our mentors, all the Black folks and other people of color who have taught us, because I know that I wouldn't know most of this, maybe not all of it, without their work and their survival. And we're standing on their shoulders. We are the representation of their hard work, and also their compassion and graciousness to teach us even when we didn't see. And so I'm really grateful for them, and grateful for the people who have held me when I didn't understand, and I'm also here to offer that to other people.
Yeah, I would also like to thank people, particularly people of color, who have brought us into the fold and trusted our integrity and trusted our commitment enough to educate us. Not that it was their job to educate us, but to be available for us, and to kind of bring a greater humanity into our struggle, and being compassionate to us, knowing, because black culture is, they have to function in two cultures. We only have to function in ours. So there's much out there that that we don't realize, and to have the trust of people of color to be able to help us on this path, or to be present with us on this path. And then to all of the wonderful scholars who are continuing to put work out there, and analysis out there. And to you, Heather, because I love you, and we'll always be doing this, even when we're old. Oh, and I do want to say, well, I'm already old. Black Lives Matter Plaza. If anyone goes on my Facebook page, there's a street in Brooklyn that was named after my ancestors, Joralemon Street. It's a main street in Brooklyn, and that intersection of Joralemon Street and Court Street has been renamed Black Lives Matter Boulevard. So I'm like, yes. And we were not slaveholders. We did not own any enslaved people in our time in Brooklyn in the 1600s. So yeah, I feel really, that just makes me feel really good. And it's
like weaving the parts of your life together.
Yeah, it's like there is a God, it's divine. So I need to live up to that, challenge myself, be constantly challenging myself, and being compassionate and kind with people that I want to challenge as well.
Yeah.
So
thank you so much, Maggie.
Thank you.
I love you. Thank you for all your guidance and support and love over the years. And I hope you'll come back sometime, and we'll talk some more.
Yeah, we will. Okay.
All right.
Love you.
Love you.
Bye.
Bye.